Hi, everyone. I'm David Hicks. I'm Senior Vice President at IHS Markit, running our upstream energy business. This is the second in a continuing series of talks about digital transformation and the impact on the upstream E&P business. Today, we're going to talk about disrupting the disruption. So we know that digital transformation in and of itself is a disrupting factor, hopefully in a very positive way for the E&P business. But with the global pandemic and some of the impacts we've seen around pricing, we're going to talk today a little bit about digital transformation within that environment. Joining me is a host of experts here from IHS Markit, Rachel Calvert, who leads all of our regulatory sort of above ground risk issues in the upstream world. Michael Wynn, who runs our international business covering data, software, insight, and Judd Jacobs, who leads our upstream research space in technology and innovation. So welcome, everyone. It's nice to be together again. So again, just as a very brief intro, what we're really looking at is what can we say about the impact of COVID, the impact of this current world economics on digital transformation, which was already well underway. Rachel, why don't you start from your perspective and tell us a little bit about how you see that impact?
Yeah, I mean, for the industry as a whole, obviously we had demand devastation as kind of our impact point number one after the pandemic really kicked off, and then a huge price collapse that's really rearranged the E&P sector as a whole. So we've had huge capex cuts, around 30% on average, especially for exploration. We've had a lot of FIDs delayed, we've had shut-ins, we've had really significant operational disruptions just in terms of basic ability to move people and equipment in and out of field sites, and that's caused project delays. So we've had some pretty dramatic short-term impacts. And then as we look longer term for the sector as a whole, there's a lot of slower burning issues around non-payment that are going to grow over time, contract disputes related to force majeure that will take years to work out. And for host governments who are looking to bring in E&P investment, a lot more constraints coming from having less revenues than they've had in the past, potentially greater civil unrest and stability challenges that can limit what they can do in the sector. And those constraints are going to be a lot more slower burning than what we've seen immediately on the industry. So we have this big landscape of disruption, and on one hand, it's been quite dramatic. On the other hand, I think it's been a real validation of the digitization that's happened in the industry to date. Our geologists are working from home, but wells are still being drilled.
So yeah, that's great, Rachel. And I'm curious, there must be different regions, different countries where perhaps the pandemic and the COVID environment is sort of emphasizing either positively or negatively, depending on maybe how those regions were getting digitalized in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. I think for a lot of governments where we saw, some really just fundamental fault lines when it came to revenues and stability, that's been worsened to a large degree. So countries like Iraq, Venezuela, of course, coming under a lot more strain. More broadly, though, for governments as a whole, I think this has had a huge impact on their ability to offer upstream opportunities, and whether or not they can do that has to do with how much they've digitized. So if you look at bid rounds, we've had over 25 bid rounds globally that have either been delayed, postponed, or extended since the pandemic started. And the ones that are able to go ahead are the ones that have complete online digital data rooms that people can access from abroad. So that's a real game changer for governments in terms of how they can engage with the industry.
Great. Yeah. And so that leads me to my next question. Judd, why don't you start on this? But it's a bit of an odd question, but is there anything that we see that the pandemic has done as it applies to digital transformation that we would consider a positive? And of course, we separate this all away from the human and economic tragedy. But is there anything that is maybe catalyzing digital transformation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Rachel pointed out some of the disruptions that we're seeing, both operational disruptions and business disruptions as well. And I think the industry has really been tested, and kind of the resiliency of the business, and certainly, the near term, it's been stabilizing the business, continuing to operate. And I think we've passed, and I think Rachel mentioned that we're still continuing to work. What we're seeing is that even those individuals, the geophysicists, the geologists who require significant compute-intense resources to do their jobs, have been able to do so. We're seeing a lot of the field workforce being able to either continue to kind of go on site or continue to work remotely in some cases. And I think it's a real testament to the industry in that we've kind of passed this resiliency test. And I think some of that bodes well to the investments that we've made over the last 4 or 5 years. I think if we were in this position, 3-5 years ago, we would have been much more challenged. And I think the investments that the industry has made and individual companies have made in the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure to begin to enable this digital transformation is so instrumental in allowing the industry to largely be able to continue to operate with minimal, kind of operational disruption, not to take into account the human factor as well, though.
Right. Yeah. And Mike, I mean, you've been living this, the technical evolution within upstream for, a long time. What do you see happening now, particular to the current environment?
Well, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty in the minds of many players. But effectively, what I think I'd characterize this, we've almost been in a slingshot around the dark side of the moon to gather speed. With all of the uncertainty that comes being in an unknown space, systems have been tested. Judd talked about resiliency, but really importantly, it's accelerating things. So things that were proofs of concept are now coming into reality. They've been commissioned faster than are sometimes quite conventional industry normally commissions things in order to keep the businesses going. And that's the positive, right? So as we come out from the dark side of the moon, potentially faster on that return journey than we went into it, there's a lot of benefits to look for here. An industry that went into that uncertainty already facing environmental, social, governance concerns, capital flow, all of the things we were talking about before COVID even appeared have been amplified. But we've responded to that, I think, and digital transformation is playing a huge component of that success story coming out of it.
What about, we've talked about what we believe is the growing trend of partnering, and again, we'd probably say this was pre-COVID, but impacts, emphasis on that more or less in the current world?
Yeah, I think, I'll take this one, David, but I think, the theme of collaboration is one that's going to be playing out kind of going forward. And I think it's, if we look, a little historically, in the last few years, a lot of the advances that we've made in, technology and digitalization have been in discrete areas. It's been companies, focusing on a lot of their own efforts. I think, one of the great things that's come out of this, kind of the last few months is that we're able to collaborate, and through some of the technologies that we're using today to do this call, is that this kind of collaboration theme, I think, is going to play out much more extensively in how the industry approaches a lot of things, but certainly digital transformation. I think partnerships, as we begin to see both joint technology development partnerships, I think we're seeing a lot more kind of small technology startups that are playing a much more active role, and the oil companies are working directly with them to advance some of their technology aspirations. But I think, I think collaboration is, if you kind of pre-COVID, post-COVID, is I think that becomes a much more kind of central theme around the industry.
Great. Mike, you got any other add-ons to that? You've been involved in a lot of partnering efforts recently.
Yeah, absolutely, David. I mean, I know that for some people watching this, the first thing they think of around collaboration these days is OSDU, for example, the Open Subsurface Data Universe. Massive amounts of commitment by exploration production companies before COVID struck. And when I say massive amount of commitment, I mean companies putting in 4, 5 or more full-time equivalent staff to make this work. The aim is, of course, to create a standard for industry, an open standard, which has common standards for storing data and common standards for serving them up. And therefore, the big advantage to the E&P firm is how it orchestrates innovation on the other side of those APIs to create workflows, tune them, do things differently. So it's really key that OSDU persists, and I'm seeing a lot of commitment. I think my word of caution here is that the digital acceleration we were talking about just a few moments ago might mean that some EMP firms, in an effort to come out of this and differentiate themselves, accelerate beyond the level of innovation that's going on in OSDU. In other words, they're going to outpace it. That's going to be a big thing for the industry to try and manage, because it does need to manage it. If it gets it right, we open a door for innovations come in from universities, smaller innovators, the kind of things that have been locked out for years in many cases. On that open platform, it suddenly becomes possible to encourage that sort of involvement and move the game forward. So OSDU, absolutely crucial. Partnerships will be crucial. You're already seeing raft after raft of announcement of partnerships across industry as everyone figures out how to scale the upstream universe for the next super cycle.
You know, Mike, your comments about OSDU sound like somebody with some experience of standardization efforts in the upstream space over perhaps decades. A little concern about that. So it is a great thing. It is something to watch. So Rachel, let's come back to you in sort of summary. So we talk about digital transformation, and a lot of the discussion is around the industry pushing things forward, and obviously the IOCs have a lot of resource in this space. But is there anything about the balance between, I guess, an industry push versus what we touched on at the very beginning about governments and how they're looking at digital transformation? Is that a integrated play? Is it in competition in some way?
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot about how COVID-19 has been disruptive. I think in this kind of question you could ask, has it been disruptive enough to really create that level of integration? We have quite uneven efforts across different kinds of players in the upstream industry, and then when we bring in national oil companies and governments who regulate how data is handled in the industry, after all, we see a much more uneven playing field. So disruptive enough to get that level of integration, I think, is still very much an open question. Governments are still absorbing how much the landscape to compete for upstream capital in this new world has evolved, and how much agility and cost efficiency and indeed environmental concerns are going to shape investment decisions that companies are making going forward. And you have different amounts of alignment across the government landscape there. So disruptive enough to bring those questions up in a lot of conversations, disruptive enough to really bring everyone on the same page. I think we have a greater need for some more collaboration and some more partnerships to bridge a few gaps there.
Yeah, and of course, I'm just imagining that the impact of COVID on particular governments is probably overwhelming the system, period, right? So it might in some way be retarding some of their digital transformation efforts in the current space until things calm down.
Yeah,
well, great. Thanks, everyone. Really enjoyed getting together again. Very interesting times. There will be more to come on a regular basis here, but really appreciate us having a chance to talk about this and look forward to our follow-up sessions. Thanks very much.